guys, our story for tonight is about daily life in medieval villages. But before we dive into the topic, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. And while we're at it, kindly tell us where you came from and what time you're listening now. Without further ado, let's dive in. What did peasants eat? What was a typical medieval peasant meal? How much did they eat? Let's take a look at what a day in the life of a medieval peasant looked like, complete with their morning routine. The rooster has barely started his crowing for the day, and the sun is just beginning to peek over the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink. In the heart of the village, within a humble abode, a family is stirring awake. The parents, their faces lined with the hardships of their years working the land, rise first, without the luxury of an alarm clock or the comfort of a slumbering partner to rouse them from their sleep. It's the chorus of roosters that serves as their morning call. They move with practiced silence, their bodies attuned to the rhythm of the rising sun. Meanwhile, their children, innocent and full of vigor, are fast asleep, their dreams filled with games and the adventures of the day before. The air is heavy with the scent of hay, and the soft glow of dawn seeps through the cracks in the wooden shutters, casting dancing shadows on the dirt floor. There is no time for lingering in bed. The hours of daylight are precious, and the work never seems to end. So after a brief moment of quiet contemplation, the parents rise, each lost in their thoughts, preparing to face another day in the unforgiving cycle of toil. In unison, they kneel by their makeshift bedside altar, a simple wooden board adorned with a crucifix and a few faded religious paintings. For these peasants, deeply rooted in their faith, prayer is not just a ritual, but a lifeline. It's their connection to something larger than their daily grind. With heads bowed and voices hushed, they murmur their prayers, seeking solace, strength, and a moment of tranquility amidst the chaos of their lives. This small ritual anchors them, reminding them of values beyond the endless cycle of sowing, planting, and harvesting. As they finish their silent communion with the divine, the sounds of the farm come alive, the anxious bleating of sheep, the impatient clucking of hens, and the lowing of cows wanting to be milked. The morning chorus is their call to action, a symphony urging them to start the day. With their prayers complete, the peasants now turn their attention to the pressing needs of their animals. The rooster has long finished his fanfare, and now the soft light of dawn bathes the farmyard in a golden hue. It's a scene of controlled chaos. The pigs, sleek and snorting, jostle for position around their trough, eager for their breakfast. Their coarse, short snouts twitching at the scent of slop being prepared. The hens, their beady eyes gleaming in the dim light, peck and scratch at the ground, searching for stray grains or worms. Their clucking fills the air with a constant background noise. The sheep, docile and woolly, graze peacefully in the nearby field, their soft bleating carried on the morning breeze. And the cows stand patiently by the milking stand, their warm breath mingling with the scent of hay and leather. Each animal has its place in the routine. Its needs to be tended to, its role in the peasant's life, well understood. With practiced hands, the father begins to milking. The rhythmic pull and release of the milk pail is a familiar lullaby to him. Years of doing this every morning have made it second nature. His wife, ever efficient, is already preparing the slop for the pigs, a mixture of kitchen scraps, leftover vegetables, and swill from the previous night's supper. As she throws in handfuls of grain, the pigs squeal with anticipation, their ears perked at the sound of each new addition to their breakfast. Their young son, awakened by the commotion, joins them in the yard, his hair tousled and his eyes still heavy with sleep. He stands mesmerized by the rhythm of the farm, the sights and sounds slowly chasing away the remnants of his dreams. The daughter, ever helpful, is gathering eggs from the nesting hens, her small hands deftly gathering the smooth shells, her movements as graceful and quiet as a woodland creature. The family works in a comfortable silence, the kind born of years of shared labor. There is no need for words. Every movement is in sync, every gesture anticipated. Theirs is a world of unspoken understanding, woven together by the threads of necessity and love. As the sky brightens and the shadows shrink, the family finishes their morning chores. The pigs are fed, the cows ready for their day in the fields, the sheep safely penned in, and the chickens clucking. Their breakfast finished. The sun, now fully awake, helps his father gather the tools needed for the day's work in the fields. His father, noticing the boy's keen interest, takes a moment to teach him the proper way to hold the tools, the right grip, the balance, the stance. Each lesson a step towards his son becoming a full-fledged member of the household. Their daughter, her hair braided and her dress neat, helps her mother with the remaining chores, gathering firewood, tending to the small herb garden by the house, and collecting water from the well. The well, a central feature of the village, is a place where gossip is exchanged, news travels and stories are shared. But for now, their daughter is focused on her tasks, the weight of each bucket a familiar burden. As the sun climbs higher and the dew on the grass glistens like scattered jewels, the family sets out for the fields. The father and son, their backs straight and their shoulders strong, walk side by side. The son's steps matching his father's, mirroring his gait. The mother and daughter following behind, their pace a little slower, their gazes often drifting to the distant hills. Together, they form a tableau of rural life, a microcosm of the countless peasant families dotting the European countryside in the Middle Ages. They walk in silence, the only sound the crunch of their boots on the gravel path and the murmur of the wind through the tall grasses. The fields stretch out before them, a patchwork quilt of greens and golds, a testament to the season's bounty. The air is alive with the buzz of insects, the drone of a lone bee, and the distant cawing of crows. Overhead, the sky is a clear expanse of blue, dotted with fluffy white clouds that drift lazily in the gentle breeze. For these peasants, the day ahead is filled with a quiet dignity of labor. Every furrow they plow, every seed they sow, every animal they tend to is a testament to their resilience, their connection to the land, and their enduring spirit in the face of a life that's often harsh but always demanding. Life in medieval villages revolved around the farming cycles, which were deeply intertwined with the changing seasons. These cycles were the heartbeat of village life, dictating the rhythm of work and rest for the entire community. Let's take a journey through the year and explore how these farming cycles shaped the daily lives of medieval villagers. Our story begins in early spring when the fields would start to thaw after the long, harsh winter. As the first signs of warmth crept into the air, villagers would eagerly prepare for the plowing season. This was a crucial time, as it set the stage for the entire year's harvest. Men and women would work side by side, using simple wooden plows pulled by oxen or horses. The work was backbreaking, but there was a sense of hope and renewal in the air as the earth was turned over, revealing rich, dark soil ready for planting. Once the fields were plowed, it was time for sowing. This was a delicate process that required skill and knowledge passed down through generations. Villagers would carefully scatter seeds by hand, walking up and down the freshly plowed furrows. They had to be mindful of the weather, as planting too early could result in seeds rotting in the cold, damp earth, while planting too late might mean the crops wouldn't have enough time to mature before harvest. As spring turned to summer, the focus shifted to tending the growing crops. This meant long days of weeding, watering, and protecting the precious plants from pests and diseases. Children would often help by scaring away birds that might eat the seeds or young shoots. It was a time of watchful waiting, with villagers anxiously monitoring the weather for signs of drought or storms that could damage their crops. The arrival of autumn brought with it the most intense period of activity in the farming cycle. The harvest. This was a time of both excitement and anxiety, as the success or failure of the harvest would determine the village's fortunes for the coming year. Every able-bodied person in the village would participate, from the youngest children to the oldest grandparents. They would work from dawn to dusk, using sickles to cut down the ripe grain and tying it into sheaves. The harvest was also a time of celebration. As the last sheaf was brought in, villages would often hold feasts and dances to give thanks for the bounty and to mark the end of the most labor-intensive part of the year. These celebrations were a rare chance for relaxation and enjoyment in what was otherwise a life of constant toil. But even as the harvest celebrations wound down, there was still work to be done. The grain had to be threshed to separate the edible kernels from the inedible chaff. This was typically done on a threshing floor, where the grain would be beaten with flails or trampled by animals. The kernels would then be winnowed, tossed into the air so that the wind could blow away the lighter chaff, leaving the heavier grain behind. With the harvest complete and the grain safely stored, attention turned to preparing for winter. This meant ensuring there was enough food preserved to last through the cold months when fresh produce would be scarce. Villagers would pickle vegetables, smoke meats, and store root crops in cool, dry places. They would also gather firewood and repair their homes to withstand the harsh winter weather. Winter itself was a time of relative rest in the farming cycle, but it didn't mean an end to work. This was when villagers would focus on indoor tasks, like repairing tools, spinning wool, and weaving cloth. It was also a time for storytelling and passing down knowledge to the younger generation, ensuring that the wisdom accumulated over centuries of farming would not be lost. One crucial aspect of the medieval farming cycle was the practice of letting fields rest. This concept, known as crop rotation, involved leaving a portion of the land fallow each year to allow it to recover its nutrients. While this meant less land under cultivation in any given year, it was essential for maintaining the long-term fertility of the soil. Villagers understood that taking care of the land was just as important as the crops themselves. The farming cycles also had a profound impact on social life in medieval villages. Weddings, for example, were often scheduled for the quieter winter months, when there was less work to be done in the fields. Similarly, religious festivals and fairs were timed to coincide with key points in the agricultural calendar, providing a welcome break from the relentless cycle of work. As we began, the farming cycles were more than just a way of producing food. They were the very foundation of medieval village life, shaping everything from daily routines to social customs. The rhythms of plowing, sowing, harvesting, and resting fields were deeply ingrained in the collective consciousness of these communities, creating a shared experience that bound villagers together. This connection to the land and the seasons is something that many of us in the modern world have lost touch with. But by understanding the farming cycles of medieval villages, we can gain a deeper appreciation for the challenges and joys of a life lived in close harmony with nature. Let's talk about the tools of the medieval farmer, shall we? These hard-working folks had a whole arsenal of implements to help them coax food from the stubborn earth. Now, picture this. A humble hoe, its wooden handle worn smooth from years of use, its metal blade gleaming in the morning sun. This trusty tool was a farmer's best friend, perfect for breaking up soil, weeding, and creating neat rows for planting. But that's not all, folks. The plow was the real workhorse of medieval agriculture. Imagine a hefty wooden beam with a sharp metal point, pulled by oxen or horses. This bad boy could turn over entire fields, preparing them for sowing. It was back-breaking work, but it got the job done. And let's not forget the sickle, that curved blade of death for crops. When harvest time rolled around, farmers would spend long days swinging these crescent-shaped tools, cutting down wheat, barley, and other grains. It was slow going, but hey, no one said medieval farming was a walk in the park. Now, here's the kicker. These tools weren't just set it and forget it kind of deals. Oh no, they needed constant care and attention. Imagine spending your evenings by the fire, carefully sharpening your sickle blade, or replacing a worn-out plow point. And don't even get me started on the wooden handles that were always cracking or splintering, needing repairs or a complete replacement. But wait, there's more. The medieval farmer didn't just have to worry about their own tools. They often shared expensive equipment, like plows, with their neighbors. So, you'd have to coordinate schedules, make sure everyone was pulling their weight in maintenance, and hope that your neighbor wasn't too rough on the shared plow. And let's talk about the blacksmith for a moment. This guy was like a rock star in the village. Farmers would line up to get their tools repaired or to commission new ones. The sound of hammer on anvil was like music to a farmer's ears, promising sharper blades and stronger implements. But here's the thing. All this tool maintenance wasn't just a chore. It was a vital part of the medieval farmer's life. These tools were their livelihood, their means of feeding their families and paying their dues to the local lord. A broken plow could mean a poor harvest, and a poor harvest could spell disaster. So, next time you're munching on a sandwich or enjoying a bowl of cereal, spare a thought for those medieval farmers. They didn't have fancy tractors or combine harvesters. Nope. They had hoes, plows, and sickles, and they made it work. Day in and day out, season after season. Now, imagine the satisfaction of running your hand over a freshly sharpened blade or testing the balance of a newly repaired hoe. These simple acts were part of the rhythm of medieval life, connecting farmers to their land and their labor in a way that's hard for us modern folks to fully grasp. But it wasn't all work and no play. Tool maintenance could be a social time too. Picture a group of farmers gathered in the village square, swapping tips on how to get the most life out of a plow beam or debating the best angle for a sickle blade. These conversations were more than just shop talk. They were the glue that held the community together. And let's not forget the kids. Younguns would learn the art of tool care from their parents and grandparents, picking up skills that had been passed down for generations. It was a different kind of education, one that was hands-on and practical, preparing them for the hard work that lay ahead. Now, you might be thinking, surely they had some way to make this easier. Well, they did try. Clever farmers were always tinkering, trying to improve their tools. Maybe adding a metal edge to a wooden plow to make it last longer, or experimenting with different shapes for hoe blades. It was slow progress, but over the centuries, these small innovations added up. But here's the real kicker. Despite all the care and attention, tools still broke, and when they did, it could be a real crisis. Imagine you're in the middle of plowing your field, the sun beating down on your back, and suddenly crack, your plow beam splits. That's not just an inconvenience. That's a potential disaster that could set your whole planting schedule back. So, what did our medieval farmer do in these situations? They got creative. Maybe they'd jury-rig a temporary fix with some rope and a spare piece of wood. Or they'd borrow a neighbor's plow, promising to help with their harvest in return. It was all about community and making do with what you had. And speaking of community, let's talk about the village tool shed. Many villages had a communal space where larger, more expensive tools were stored. This wasn't just a storage area. It was a hub of activity. Farmers would gather here to borrow tools, swap advice, and maybe share a bit of gossip while they were at it. Now, I know what you're thinking. All this talk of tool maintenance sounds pretty dull, but for medieval farmers, it was a source of pride. A well-maintained set of tools was a sign of a good farmer. Someone who took their work seriously and could be relied upon. And let's not forget the seasonal rhythm of tool use and maintenance. In winter, when the fields were frozen and work was scarce, farmers would spend long hours repairing and preparing their tools for the busy spring ahead. It was a time of anticipation, of planning and dreaming about the crops to come. So, there you have it, folks. The tools of the medieval farmer, simple in design, but complex in their care and significance. These humble implements were the lifeblood of village agriculture, demanding constant attention and respect. They connected farmers to the land, to their community, and to the age-old cycles of planting and harvest. Next time you see an old plow or sickle in a museum, take a moment to really look at it. Think about the hands that once wielded it, the fields it helped to cultivate, and the vital role it played in feeding and sustaining entire communities. It's a reminder of a time when our connection to the land was more direct, more visceral, and in many ways, more meaningful. And that, my friends, is the story of the medieval farmer's tools, a tale of sweat, skill, and the endless dance of maintenance that kept villages fed and thriving through the ages. It's a testament to human ingenuity and perseverance, a reminder of the hard work and dedication that went into every loaf of bread and every bowl of porridge in those long-ago days. Life inside a peasant's hut in medieval villages was far from the romanticized images we often see in movies or read about in storybooks. These humble dwellings were the heart of daily life for the majority of people during the Middle Ages, and they tell a fascinating tale of survival, ingenuity, and community. Let's start with the most distinctive feature of these homes: the thatched roofs. Picture a thick, layered covering of straw or reeds, carefully woven and packed tightly to keep out the rain and snow. These roofs were both a blessing and a curse for medieval villagers. On one hand, they provided excellent insulation, keeping the hut warm in winter and cool in summer. On the other hand, they were a constant source of worry and work. Thatched roofs needed regular maintenance to prevent leaks and rot. Every few years, the entire roof would need to be replaced, a task that often involved the whole community. Imagine the scene. Neighbors gathering to help strip off the old thatch, passing bundles of fresh straw up to the roof, and working together to secure each layer. It was back-breaking work, but it also fostered a sense of togetherness that was crucial for survival in those times. But the challenges of thatched roofs didn't end there. These roofs were also prime real estate for all sorts of critters. Mice, rats, and insects found the warm, dry thatch to be the perfect home. Peasants would often wake to the sound of little feet scurrying above their heads, or find unwelcome visitors dropping in for a visit. It wasn't uncommon for snakes to take up residence in the thatch, hunting the rodents that live there. Can you imagine trying to sleep, knowing that a snake might be coiled just a few feet above your head? Moving inside the hut, one of the first things you'd notice is the ever-present smoke. At the center of most peasant homes was an open hearth, a simple fire pit that served as the hub of daily life. This fire was crucial for cooking, heating, and light, but it came at a cost. With no chimneys, smoke from the fire would fill the hut, eventually finding its way out through the thatched roof or small windows. The constant smoke had a significant impact on the health of medieval villagers. Eye irritation, respiratory problems, and even lung diseases were common. But the smoke also served a purpose beyond cooking and heating. It helped to preserve the thatch roof from the inside, making it more resistant to rot and pests. The blackened, smoky interior of a peasant's hut might seem unpleasant to us, but for medieval villagers, it was a sign of a well-maintained home. Cooking over this open hearth was a daily challenge. Most peasants had a simple iron pot or cauldron that hung over the fire. This pot was used for everything from boiling vegetables to making stews and porridges. Bread, a staple of the medieval diet, was often baked in communal ovens rather than in individual homes. Imagine the smells that would fill the air as villagers carried their dough to the bakehouse, the aroma of fresh bread wafting through the narrow streets. When it came time to sleep, medieval peasants didn't enjoy the comfort of modern beds. Instead, they typically slept on straw-filled mattresses laid directly on the floor or on simple wooden platforms. These beds were often shared by multiple family members, providing warmth on cold nights, but also making for cramped and uncomfortable sleeping arrangements. The straw used for bedding was another source of potential problems. It needed to be changed regularly to prevent it from becoming a haven for fleas, lice, and other pests. Imagine the itching and discomfort of trying to sleep on a bed infested with biting insects. It's no wonder that many medieval remedies focused on treating skin irritations and parasites. Despite these challenges, the peasant's hut was more than just a place to sleep and eat. It was a workspace, a social center, and the heart of family life. During long winter evenings, families would gather around the fire to work on crafts, mend clothes, or simply talk and share stories. Children might learn skills from their parents, passing down traditions that had been practiced for generations. The hut was also a place of birth and death, of celebration and mourning. Babies were born here, with midwives attending to mothers in the flickering firelight. The elderly spent their final days in these same rooms, surrounded by family and the familiar sights and smells of home. In Mani walls, the peasant's hut was a microcosm of medieval village life. It reflected the hardships and challenges faced by ordinary people, but also their resilience and ingenuity. These simple dwellings tell us so much about how our ancestors lived, worked, and survived in a world very different from our own. As we look back on these homes, it's easy to focus on the difficulties and discomforts, but we should also remember the sense of community and family that these spaces felt. In a world without modern entertainment or distractions, the peasant's hut was a place of connection and shared experience. The next time you're in a modern home, with its solid roof, clean air, and comfortable beds, take a moment to appreciate how far we've come, but also remember the strength and adaptability of those who came before us, who made homes and built lives in conditions we can scarcely imagine today. Life in a medieval peasant's hut was undoubtedly hard, but it was also rich with human experience. It's a testament to the enduring spirit of ordinary people throughout history, who found ways to create warmth, comfort, and community, even in the most challenging circumstances. All right, folks, let's talk about medieval clothing for villagers. Now, you might be thinking, what's so interesting about what people wore hundreds of years ago? Well, let me tell you, it's not just about fashion. It's about understanding how people lived their daily lives in those times. So, picture this. You're walking through a medieval village, and what do you see? Everywhere you look, people are wearing these long, loose-fitting tunics. These weren't just any old shirts, mind you. They were made of wool. And let me tell you, wool was a big deal back then. It was warm, it was durable, And most importantly, it was readily available. Now, you might be wondering, how did they make these tunics? Well, it wasn't as simple as popping down to the local clothing store. No, sir. These tunics were often hand-spun and hand-woven. Can you imagine the time and effort that went into making just one piece of clothing? It's no wonder people didn't have massive wardrobes like we do today. But let's not forget about the belts. Almost everyone, from the poorest peasant to the wealthiest merchant, wore a belt. These weren't just for holding up their pants, though. Leather belts were used to carry all sorts of things. Think of them as the medieval equivalent of a tool belt or a purse. You'd see people with knives, pouches, and all sorts of other useful items hanging from their belts. Now, here's something interesting. The length of your tunic could actually tell people a lot about your social status. If you were a working man, your tunic would probably be shorter, maybe knee length. This was practical. You see, you didn't want your clothes getting in the way when you were out in the fields or working in a workshop. But if you were a bit higher up on the social ladder, you might wear a longer tunic. It was a way of showing off that you didn't need to do manual labor. Let's talk about colors for a moment. Nowadays, we're used to seeing clothes in all sorts of bright, vibrant colors. But in medieval times, things were a bit more earthy. Most villagers' clothes were in natural, undyed colors. We're talking browns, grays, That's because dyes were expensive, and most ordinary folk couldn't afford them. If you saw someone wearing brightly colored clothes, chances are they were pretty well off. Now, you might be thinking, didn't they get bored wearing the same old thing all the time? Well, here's the thing. Clothes weren't about fashion back then, at least not for most people. They were about practicality. Your clothes needed to keep you warm, protect you from the elements, and last a long time. And let me tell you, they knew how to make clothes last. People would patch and mend their clothes over and over again. A good tunic could last 40 years, but it wasn't all drab and boring. Women, in particular, found ways to add a bit of flair to their outfits. They might embroider the edges of their tunics, or add decorative bands around the neck or sleeves. It was a way of expressing themselves and adding a bit of beauty to their everyday lives. Let's not forget about footwear. Most villagers wore simple leather shoes or boots. These weren't the fancy, polished shoes we're used to today. They were sturdy, practical, and designed to withstand the muddy streets and rough terrain of medieval life. In the summer, many people, especially children, might go barefoot to save their shoes for colder weather. Now, here's something that might surprise you. Underwear, as we know it today. It didn't really exist. Most people wore a linen undertunic, called a chemise, next to their skin. This served as both underwear and nightwear, and yes, they slept in it too. Hygiene wasn't quite what it is today, so having a layer between your skin and your outer clothes was pretty important. Let's talk about hats for a moment. In medieval times, covering your head wasn't just a fashion choice. It was often a necessity. For working in the fields, a wide-brimmed straw hat would protect you from the sun. In colder weather, you might see people wearing woolen caps or hoods. And for women, especially married women, covering their hair was often seen as a sign of modesty. Now, you might be wondering about children's clothes. Well, here's an interesting tidbit. Once children were out of swaddling clothes, they basically wore miniature versions of adult clothing. There wasn't really such a thing as children's fashion back then. As soon as a child could walk and help out with chores, they were dressed like little adults. Let's not forget about the importance of hand-me-downs. Clothes were valuable, and nothing went to waste. When a piece of clothing became too worn or small for one family member, it would be passed down to another. A man's tunic might become a woman's dress, which might then be cut down to make clothes for children. Now, here's something to think about. In our modern world, we're used to having different outfits for different occasions. But for most medieval villagers, they might only own 1 or 2 sets of clothes. Can you imagine wearing pretty much the same thing every day? It really puts our overflowing wardrobes into perspective, doesn't it? Let's talk about laundry for a moment. Washing clothes wasn't as simple as throwing them in a machine with some detergent. It was hard work. Clothes were often washed in streams or rivers, using natural soaps made from plant ashes and animal fat, and drying. Well, that was at the mercy of the weather. No tumble dryers in medieval times. Now, you might be wondering about special occasion clothes. Well, Most villagers would have a best outfit that they kept for church or important events. This might be made of slightly better quality fabric, or it might be a bit newer and less patched, but it wouldn't be drastically different from their everyday wear. Let's not forget about the importance of wool in medieval clothing. Sheep were a common sight in medieval villages, and their wool was incredibly valuable. Villagers would spend hours spinning wool into yarn, which could then be woven into fabric. It was a time-consuming process, but it meant that even the poorest villagers could have warm, durable clothing. Now, here's an interesting fact. In many places, there were actually laws about what people could wear. These sumptuary laws were designed to maintain social distinctions. They might dictate what colors or fabrics certain social classes could wear. So if you saw someone wearing silk or fur, you'd know they were pretty high up the social ladder. Let's talk about accessories for a moment. Jewelry as we know it today was pretty rare among villagers, but that doesn't mean they didn't decorate themselves. Women might wear simple brooches to fasten their cloaks, or perhaps a string of glass beads for special occasions. Men might have a decorative buckle on their belt. These small touches were ways of adding a bit of personal flair to their outfits. Now, imagine the smell. With limited options for washing and the fact that most people owned very few clothes, you can bet that medieval villages had a pretty distinct aroma. It's not something we often think about when we picture life in those times, but it was a very real part of daily life. So, there you have it, folks. A glimpse into the world of medieval clothing for villagers. It's a far cry from our world of fast fashion and endless choices, isn't it? But in many ways, it was a more sustainable approach to clothing. Nothing was wasted. Everything was used until it couldn't be used anymore. Alright, folks. We're delving into the fascinating world of women's roles in medieval village life. Now, you might be thinking, what's so interesting about that? Well, let me tell you. These ladies were the unsung heroes of their time, keeping everything running smoothly behind the scenes. So, let's take a journey back in time and explore the daily lives of these incredible women. First up, we've got cooking. Now, this wasn't your average meal prep. Oh no, these women were like the master chefs of their era. But without all the fancy gadgets we have today, imagine having to cook for a whole family, sometimes even extended family, using just a fire pit and some basic utensils. That's right, no microwaves, no electric stoves, not even a gas range. These ladies had to get creative with what they had. They'd start their day early, way before the crack of dawn, to get the fire going. This wasn't just flicking a switch, mind you. They had to gather wood, start the fire from scratch, and keep it going all day long. And let me tell you, that was no easy task. The fire was the heart of the home, used not just for cooking, but for warmth and light too. Now, what were they cooking, you ask? Well, it wasn't your typical fast food menu. We're talking hearty stews, thick soups, and lots of bread. Bread was a staple in medieval diets, and guess who was responsible for baking it? Yep, the women. They'd mix the dough, knead it beyond, no fancy mixers here, and then bake it in communal ovens. These ovens were like the village hotspot, where women would gather to bake and catch up on the latest gossip. But cooking wasn't just about throwing ingredients together. Oh no, these women had to be smart about it. They had to preserve food for the winter months when fresh produce was scarce. So, they'd spend hours pickling vegetables, smoking meats, and making jams. It was like extreme meal prepping, medieval style. Now, let's move on to weaving. This wasn't just a hobby, folks. It was a crucial part of village life. Women were responsible for making pretty much all the textiles used in the household. We're talking clothes, bedding, tablecloths, you name it. And remember, they didn't have the luxury of popping down to the local store to buy fabric. Nope, they had to make it all from scratch. The process started with spinning. Women would take raw wool or flax and spin it into thread using a spindle or a spinning wheel. This was a time-consuming process that required a lot of skill and patience. You couldn't just zone out and binge-watch your favorite show while doing this. It required constant attention and dexterity. Once they had their thread, it was time for weaving. Now, looms back, then weren't the high-tech machines we have today. They were simple wooden frames that required a lot of manual work. Women would spend hours, sometimes days, weaving a single piece of cloth. And let me tell you, it wasn't just about getting the job done. These ladies took pride in their work. often incorporating intricate patterns and designs into their weaving. But wait, there's more. Once the cloth was woven, it didn't just magically turn into clothes. Oh no. There was still more work to be done. Women were also responsible for sewing and mending clothes for the entire family. Imagine having to make and repair every single piece of clothing by hand. No sewing machines. No quick fixes. Just needle, thread, and a whole lot of patience. Now, you might be thinking, surely that's enough work for one person. But hold on to your hats, folks, because we're not done yet. On top of all this cooking and weaving, women also played a crucial role in helping out in the fields. That's right. They weren't just confined to the home. When harvest time came around, everyone had to pitch in, including the women. They'd be out there in the fields, helping to harvest crops, gather hay, and tend to the animals. This wasn't just light work. Mind you, we're talking about hard, physical labor under the hot sun. And remember, they didn't have the luxury of modern farming equipment. Everything was done by hand, with simple tools like scythes and rakes. But it wasn't just during harvest time that women helped out in the fields. Throughout the year, they'd be responsible for tending to the household garden. This wasn't just a little veggie patch for fun. These gardens were crucial for providing fresh produce for the family. Women would grow a variety of vegetables, herbs, and even medicinal plants. They had to know what to plant, when to plant it, and how to care for it. It was like being a farmer, a botanist, and a doctor all rolled into one. And let's not forget about the animals. Many households kept chickens, pigs, or even a cow. Guess who was responsible for looking after them? Yep, you guessed it, the women. They'd feed the animals, clean out their pens, and even help with things like milking cows or collecting eggs. It was like running a mini farm on top of everything else. Now, you might be wondering, how on earth did these women manage to do all this? Well, let me tell you, it wasn't easy. Their days were long, and their work was hard. They'd be up before dawn, and often working well into the night. But here's the thing, they weren't working in isolation. Village life was all about community, and women played a huge role in fostering that sense of community. They'd often work together, sharing tasks and helping each other out. Imagine a group of women gathered around the village well, collecting water but also catching up on the latest news, and supporting each other through tough times. Or picture them working side by side in the fields, sharing stories and songs to make the hard work a little more bearable. And let's not forget about the crucial role women played in passing down knowledge and skills. They weren't just doing all this work for themselves. They were teaching their daughters, nieces, and younger women in the village. All these skills, cooking, weaving, gardening, were passed down from generation to generation. It was like an informal apprenticeship system, ensuring that vital knowledge and traditions were preserved. So there you have it, folks, a glimpse into the lives of women in medieval villages. They were the ultimate multitaskers, juggling cooking, weaving, and fieldwork, all while keeping their families and communities together. Next time you're struggling with your to-do list, just think about these incredible women and the challenges they faced every single day. It really puts things into perspective, doesn't it? Medieval villages had very different living conditions compared to our modern ones. Housing was normally communal, sanitation was non-existent, and jobs were hard and dangerous. Let's see what life would be like if we went back in time to live out a typical day in the life of a medieval peasant village. After waking up before sunrise, your first task will be breakfast. This might consist of bread, cheese, and perhaps some porridge or eggs. For children, their day will start with chores. We don't have to go back to the Middle Ages to find kids doing household work. It's common for children even today to help their parents around the house and learn how to do things that need to be done. And it was no different during the Middle Ages. However, many scholars agree that child labor in medieval times was much more intense than what is considered normal today. In medieval villages, all children above the age of 6 helped out with the daily tasks, such as looking after animals, gathering firewood, and guarding crops against pests. They also assisted with cooking, cleaning, and other household work. Depending on the family's social status, they could also be sent to work in the fields. Since children started working at such an early age, they had the opportunity to learn skills and knowledge relevant to the trades of their family. For example, learning how to cultivate crops, or how to fix shoes. Some families could afford to send their children to a local school to learn how to read, write, and do basic math. But this was not the case for most peasants who had little time and money to spare. While children looked after younger siblings or did other domestic chores, older boys and girls helped out with gathering firewood. The collection of fuel was important for everyday life in medieval villages, as wood was needed for heating and cooking. Villagers would go out into the forest at the nearby hills to gather branches and logs. Young children could only collect small pieces of wood, while older children and adults had higher expectations. When returning home, the collected firewood was put aside until it was needed. In some cases, people used firewood as building material to make their houses sturdier. For storage, better quality wood was often preferred, and larger pieces were reserved for special occasions like making a coffin. After breakfast, children looked after the animals. Raising livestock was important for villagers who depended on them for food and other products like leather. Each morning, children would have to feed, groom, and water farm animals, such as pigs, chickens, cows, sheep, and goats. As they grew older, they took on additional responsibilities like herding animals to and from the pasture. They would spend hours each day watching over the livestock and making sure predators didn't get close. If something happened to the animals, the child would be severely punished. To keep the animals safe, children made whistles out of reeds to communicate with each other. If they heard a wolf whistling, they knew they had to make noise and scare the animal away. Sometimes they also played games while herding animals, but that could end badly since the children's duty was to watch over the livestock, and any game that distracted them could result in serious consequences. When herding the animals, children could play with a simple toy made out of wood. A popular one was the medieval bow and ball, which could be played both indoors and outdoors. Its rules were similar to those of marbles. Two players faced each other and threw a small ball towards their opponent, trying to hit them so they would scatter. Another simple toy was the medieval spinning top. This was made out of wood and a sharp stone. The stone was placed on the top of the spindle and spun by hand. Kids would then try to knock the top over using sticks. They could also play with dolls made out of wood, rags, or animal skins. These dolls were often given to children by their mothers. After all, there wasn't much else to do in medieval villages for entertainment. Once the animals were back at the village, the children could wash themselves and prepare for lunch. Often this meal consisted of vegetables, meat, bread, and wine. While children enjoyed their meal, their parents might take some time to tell them stories about knights, dragons, or faraway lands. Unfortunately, not all stories were appropriate for children's ears, as these tales were sometimes quite violent and sexual in nature. After lunch, children continued with their daily chores. This could include washing clothes by hand, tending to vegetable gardens, collecting eggs from chickens, or helping out with repairs around the house. During summer, children were expected to guard the fields and prevent crops from being destroyed by insects or animals. Sometimes they were given a stick and a bag and tasked to collect blackberries growing along field borders. In winter, children would spend their days indoors. As it got dark earlier, they could help their mothers prepare meals or take care of younger siblings. If their parents were too busy, children were left to fend for themselves and might stay indoors playing games with their toys. When it comes to food, winters were difficult for children. Hunger was a constant threat, and malnutrition led to stunted growth and weak immune systems. Children were often thin and dirty, with matted hair and ragged clothes. Their teeth were bad and they had a high mortality rate. Many children died from the effects of cold, hunger, or disease. It wasn't uncommon for entire families to be wiped out by an illness. If there was a doctor in the village, children could be sent to him for treatment when they got sick. However, medical knowledge in medieval villages was limited. Treatments were often ineffective and sometimes even dangerous. People believed that illnesses were caused by an imbalance of the four humors. Doctors tried to restore balance through bloodletting, bleaching, and other methods. Children suffering from long-term illnesses were often kept isolated from other villagers to avoid spreading diseases. As the evening approached, children spent their last hours playing. Games such as hide-and-seek and tag were popular among them. Children also liked to play with hoops, balls, and tops. At night, children slept next to their parents in a shared bed. There wasn't much to do at night except tell stories and sing songs. Entertainment was rare and education was almost non-existent. Most children were too poor to own books, and schooling was reserved for the wealthier members of society. The following day, children will wake up again before sunrise and do the same chores and tasks until sunset, depending on the season. their duties might change. For example, during harvest time, children were expected to pick ripe crops and carry baskets full of fruit or grain to the storage rooms. Similarly, when it came time to plant crops, children helped make furrows in the soil and sow seeds. No matter the time of year, children had to listen to their parents and other adults, especially since corporal punishment was common. Parents and other members of society often hid children to enforce obedience and punish them for their mistakes. Even though life for children in medieval villages was full of challenges, they found joy in their daily lives. Playing games with friends, taking care of animals, or simply enjoying a meal were moments of happiness in their otherwise difficult lives. Medieval villages are normally what people think of when they hear about medieval times. And for good reason. Life in a medieval city was brutal, dirty, and dangerous. The countryside, while not as glamorous, was usually much more pleasant. We're gonna look at food in a typical medieval village and what an average person might eat in a day. Welcome back to the channel! If you love anything to do with the Middle Ages, then make sure to subscribe to get notified when we release a new video. Also, stick around until the end of the video to find out how you can get a free book on medieval life. When imagining what the common folk in medieval Europe ate, one might think of the stereotypical image of peasants eating only bland and boring foods such as watery soup and stale bread. However, their diet was quite varied and actually quite delicious, if we do say so ourselves. Let's take a look at what an average peasant might have eaten in a day. During the Middle Ages, the majority of the population were farmers. They would typically own small plots of land and grow crops such as wheat, barley, oats, and rye. Peasants also kept livestock, including chickens, pigs, goats, and cows. What they grew and raised would be the foundation of their diet. Breakfast, like lunch and dinner, consisted of bread, which was made from the crops they had grown. Bread was a staple in medieval diets. It was cheap, easy to store, and high in calories. It could be made sweet or savory and was a blank canvas for experimentation in the kitchen. In fact, there were over 30 different recipes for bread during the Middle Ages, ranging from white bread made with expensive wheat to brown bread made with cheaper grains. A simple loaf of bread could last a family a few days. The peasants also enjoyed milk from their animals, which they either drank fresh or fermented into a type of sour milk drink called merit. Some wealthier peasants may have also enjoyed eggs from their chickens, which could be boiled, fried, or poached. Finally, fruit preserves made from berries and plums were a popular addition to any medieval breakfast. Lunch was usually eaten in the field and was often a second breakfast rather than a full meal. Peasants would typically eat bread dipped in their leftover pottage from dinner, along with some cheese or fruit. Some peasants who owned pigs might also enjoy a slice of bacon. Pottage is a thick soup or stew that was very popular in medieval times. It was made by boiling vegetables such as carrots, onions, cabbage, and leeks alongside grain, meat, or fruit. The ingredients would be chopped up and mixed together after cooking. This was a great way of using leftovers and was considered a peasant's version of stew. A cold pottage could also be made by leaving milk or beer to sour and adding fruit, spices, and sometimes alcohol. During the Middle Ages, alcohol was a common part of people's diets, especially for those working long hours in the fields. Ale was the most common type of alcoholic beverage consumed in medieval Europe. It was made from fermented grain and was considered safe to drink, unlike water. During the Middle Ages, it was common for families to brew their own beer at home. Beer was served with meals and was even given to children to drink. However, it should be noted that medieval ale was much weaker than modern beer, containing between 0.5 and 1.5% alcohol. Medieval peasants had very little access to salt, so they often relied on other methods of preserving their food, such as drying fruit and vegetables or making them into preserves. Dried fruit could be rehydrated and used in desserts or main meals, while dried vegetables could be used to add flavor to soups and stews. Preserves were made by cooking fruit with sugar or honey and then sealing them in a jar. This allowed the fruit to be enjoyed all year round and prevented it from spoiling. A typical medieval peasant would consume between 1,200 and 1,800 calories per day. Of course, this varied depending on the season and the amount of physical work they had to do. During the harvest season, peasants would work long hours in the fields and would need more calories to sustain them. Meat was not a common part of the peasant diet, but during the Middle Ages, many villagers would keep a pig or two. Pigs were scavengers, and didn't require much looking after. They were fed scraps from the family's meals and were eventually fattened up for slaughter. The meat was then salted and preserved for later use. Sometimes a family might set aside a pig for a special occasion, such as a wedding or a religious holiday. When a pig was slaughtered, every part of the animal was used. The skin was used to make leather, the bones were used to make broth, and even the hair was used for stuffing mattresses. Although meat was rare, it was usually enjoyed as a treat. Medieval peasants would often eat pork alongside apples and cabbage, a filling combination that sustained them through the winter months. Sometimes, a peasant family would catch fish from a nearby river or lake. Fish was a great source of protein and was often cooked by being wrapped in a cloth and boiled. Although dairy products were a staple of the medieval peasant diet, cheese was considered a luxury item. Most families couldn't afford to buy cheese on a regular basis, but they could make it themselves from their cow or goat's milk. Cheese was often served with bread as part of a peasant's evening meal. During the Middle Ages, goat's cheese was popular amongst the peasantry. It was easier to make and required less milk than cow's cheese. Goat's milk was also higher in butterfat, making it ideal for cheese making. It could be stored for longer and was a better source of nutrition. Goats were also easier to keep than cows and could survive on less food. In areas where trees were scarce, the peasants would make a type of cheese from goat's milk, and the weeds known as ashon was a type of wild spinach which grew in abundance across Europe. It had a slightly salty taste and was rich in iron and calcium, so it was an ideal ingredient to add to cheese, especially in areas where milk was scarce. During the Middle Ages, poultry was a common sight on farms across Europe. Chickens, geese, and ducks were popular choices because they were relatively easy to keep and provided both meat and eggs. While chickens were popular throughout the year, ducks and geese were typically reserved for special occasions. This was due to their slower growth rate and the fact that they required more resources to keep. When a chicken was slaughtered, the peasant family would use every part of the bird. The meat would be roasted or boiled, and the feathers would be saved for making pillows. During the Middle Ages, it was common for poor families to stuff their pillows with feathers instead of straw or down. As you can see, life in a medieval village wasn't too bad. Sure, there was poverty and hardship, but the villagers had a strong sense of community, and they knew where their food came from. Their diet was varied and actually quite delicious. Medieval villages may seem like sleepy rural backwaters, but life here is anything but slow. We'll find out what a typical day is like in the village when one of the most important events in medieval life takes place. It's baking day. In many medieval villages, baking bread was a communal affair. Villagers would take their flour and water and make the dough for the bread at home. But after that, they'd have to bring their wares to a communal oven where they'd wait their turn and then pay the oven owner to bake their bread. This meant that villagers had to spend time socializing with each other while they waited for their breads to bake. In some cases, this might have been an opportunity for gossip and catching up with your neighbors. In other cases, it might mean that you needed to bring a game to pass the time. For example, there was a record of a baker in 14th century England who was fined because he allowed children to play in his oven while it was in use. In fact, people were fined for all kinds of reasons relating to the communal ovens. For example, in 1323, a woman from Gloucester was fined 2 shillings because she paid someone else to bake her bread, which technically meant that she was paying someone else to take her turn at the communal oven. That same year, a man from Devon was fined 6 shillings because he refused to let a woman use his oven. He also got in trouble because he was baking on the wrong night. The night before Ascension Day, it was forbidden to bake because it was thought that witches were particularly active at night. Now, if you didn't want to wait around for the communal oven, you could always build your own. In fact, by the end of the Middle Ages, most wealthy households had their own brick or stone ovens. But even these private ovens required a lot of work. The family had to make sure that it was heated throughout the night, so that it would be ready to bake bread first thing in the morning. After the bread was baked, the ashes had to be saved and used for cleaning, and the oven itself had to be cleaned with a stiff brush made out of old, stiff bread crusts. To get the dough ready for baking, the women would often get up very early and start kneading. They would need to do this with bare, floury hands. If they used gloves, the dough would stick to their fingers. In fact, kneading bread was such an essential task that there was a proverb in 14th century England: "He that will have his bread kneaded must get up betimes." Once the bread was kneaded and left to rise, the women might get on with other tasks. This might include making cheese, churning butter or tending to the animals. The men were usually responsible for getting fuel for the oven, as well as killing and butchering animals, so they might go hunting or take an animal to the village butcher. While the men were gone, the women might prepare a meal, spin flax, or weave cloth. Once the bread was ready to bake, the women would wrap it up and head to the communal oven. They would need to bring a few things with them. Obviously, they would need the bread and a cloth to put it on, but they would also likely bring a small stool to sit on while they waited their turn. In some cases, women might bring a small knife to scrape any extra dough off of the bread. And finally, they would bring money to pay the baker for their services. The amount that they owed him would depend on the size of the loaf. Usually, the baker would post a schedule with the going prices, which would vary based on the type of flour that was being used. Since white flour was more expensive than whole wheat flour, it would cost more to bake. In addition to paying for the actual baking, there were sometimes other expenses involved. For example, in 14th century France, bakers kept a sharp eye out for customers who tried to sneak extra loaves into the oven without paying for them. And in 1398, a French judge ordered that anyone who stole a loaf of bread from a communal oven should have their hand cut off. Even though it might have been worth it to own your own oven, that wasn't always possible. A wealthy urban family might be able to afford one, but a poor peasant family would need to share. For them, heading to the communal oven was just another part of daily life. When they arrived, there would be other villagers there, some of whom they would know well and others that they wouldn't. There would be farmers who lived nearby and merchants who were traveling through. There would be young people and old people, men and women. All of them would be waiting their turn for the baker to finish with the bread that was already in the oven. If the queue was long, this could mean a lot of waiting around. Luckily, the baker had probably brought something with him to pass the time, like a flute or a fiddle. Music was common entertainment in medieval villages. It wasn't necessarily played by professional musicians. Instead, it was played by members of the community who simply liked to play. So while the baker played music, the villagers would socialize, telling jokes, and maybe even playing games until it was their turn to put their bread in the oven. When it was their turn, the woman would place her bread on the baker's peel, a large flat metal spatula that he used to slide the bread into the oven. The baker would then slide the bread into the oven, pull the door closed and set a timer. While they waited for their bread to bake, the villagers would continue socializing. Depending on how busy the baker was, this could take anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours. If the baker had a lot of bread to put in the oven, the villagers might decide to play a game called Ludo, which was similar to checkers. Or they might play a word game called Calva, which required players to name all the things they could remember that started with a certain letter. Once the timer was up, the baker would open the oven and remove the bread. He would then place the hot loaves on a rack to cool and give the customer their still warm bread. The customer would give the baker his fee and take their bread away. The bread would last them a few days, and then they'd have to come back to the communal oven for more. The entire process would start again. Communal ovens weren't just found in villages. They were also found in cities. Except in the cities, they were usually attached to a monastery or a church rather than belonging to a private individual. No matter where the oven was located, it was usually a central gathering spot for the community. In some cases, the bread that was baked there might have been the only hot food that some people ate all week. In other cases, the communal oven might have been the only place that villagers could cook meat, since their own homes might not have had enough room for a proper cooking fire. Either way, the communal oven was more than just a place to bake bread. It was a place for the community to come together and socialize. But what if you couldn't make it to the communal oven? What if you were too sick or too old to carry your bread there? No worries. Someone would bring the oven to you. At least they would in Paris. Starting in the late 13th century, Parisian bakers began offering a delivery service. These bakers would go door to door, collecting the bread that had been prepared at home. They would then take it to a central oven, where they would bake it and return it to the customer. Of course, this service did not come free. Customers had to pay the baker an extra fee for the delivery, but it was worth it for those who couldn't make the trip to the communal oven themselves. What was daily life like in a medieval village? How did its residents make money? What did they eat, and how did they dispose of their waste? Throughout the High Middle Ages, roughly between 1000 and 1300 AD, villages across Europe looked much the same. They consisted of a central square where people gathered for markets or to be judged by the local lord. Narrow, winding streets branched off from the square and ended at the villagers' homes, which were usually made of wood or stone and had thatched roofs. The streets were often dirty and smelled of stale waste and chamber pots. Animals roamed freely through the village, doing their business wherever they pleased. Houses didn't have indoor plumbing, so people would throw their waste out into the street. Rubbish would pile up in the gutters, and the entire village would stink. But the animals didn't mind, and neither did the villagers, because their noses had simply grown accustomed to the smell. Most medieval villages were fairly small, housing anywhere from 200 to 500 people. That might sound tiny compared to modern cities, but keep in mind that at this time period, most people lived in rural areas and farmed the land. While some communities were large enough to be called towns, most medieval villages were just settlements of farmers and farm laborers. A typical village might include a handful of merchants, a miller, a blacksmith, a carpenter, a tailor, a cooper or barrel maker, a shoemaker, a fool, antana, a baker, an innkeeper, a priest, and in larger villages, there might also be a doctor or a lawyer. Each of these occupations had its own guild or organized group of specialists. In theory, members of each guild set standards for quality and regulated prices. In practice, guilds were often little more than exclusive social clubs that kept out poor people and outsiders. The typical village was dominated by the local lord's manor house, which might be a simple farmhouse or a true palace. On the grounds of the manor house, there would be stables, barns, and other outbuildings for storing crops and farm equipment. Fields stretched from the manor house in all directions, reaching to the edge of the village and beyond. At the center of the village, there was likely a church, which doubled as a community building. The local priest would hold services, but he also taught school, recorded births, marriages, and deaths, and served as a judge in minor disputes. Sometimes a village would also have a small hospital or hospice for the sick and poor. Most villagers, though, were too busy working to worry about hospitals. Work was the heart of village life in the Middle Ages. Men, women, and children got up before sunrise and worked all day, only stopping to eat and sleep. Some people worked in the fields growing food. Others made and sold crafts or provided services for the community. Work continued late into the night. If you were the miller, for example, and your water mill ground grain for the villagers during the day, you might choose to work through the night so you could finish faster and have the next day off. People took great pride in their work. Peasants who farmed the land considered themselves free men, even if they were technically serfs, bound to the land. Craftsmen saw their work as an art form, and many merchants prided themselves on providing honest service. Children started working at a very young age. Boys typically helped their fathers in the fields or learned a trade from their uncles or older brothers. Girls helped their mothers with cooking and cleaning and learned domestic skills that would help them run a household. A long day's work required lots of food. The typical medieval peasant ate 3 meals a day. Breakfast consisted of bread, cheese, and beer, ale, or cider. Lunch was a thin soup made with whatever vegetables were in season. Dinner included more bread, along with meat or fish, porridge, fruit, or nuts. Peasants favored certain dishes because they were easy to prepare and required little fuel. Soup was a common midday meal because it could be made over an open fire and eaten quickly. Heartier stews and roasts were reserved for special occasions, like religious holidays or the arrival of important guests. Although meat was relatively expensive, villagers tried to eat as much of it as possible. Meat provided the protein necessary to maintain strength and stamina, both physically and mentally. It was also a status symbol, and peasants wanted to seem as well off as possible. Meals were eaten with the hands, although wealthier villagers might use knives and spoons. Food was served on wooden plates, pewter platters, or ceramic bowls. Tankards of ale or cider accompanied nearly every meal. Children were expected to eat whatever was given to them and eat it quickly. Leftovers were given to animals or thrown away. Nothing was wasted. Animals played a major role in the lives of medieval villagers. Chickens provided eggs and meat. Pigs were allowed to roam freely through the village and countryside. They ate whatever scraps people threw away and grew fat, without needing any care. Villagers would then slaughter the pigs and preserve the meat for the winter. Cows, sheep, and goats provided milk and cheese. Their meat was also used for sausages and other processed foods. Sheep were especially important because their wool could be used to make clothing. Unlike other animals, sheep were generally not allowed to wander through the village. Herders watched over them as they grazed in the fields and made sure they didn't stray too far. Sheep were vulnerable to attacks from wolves and other predators, so herders carried staffs and dogs to defend them. Raising sheep required hard work, but it was essential for villagers' survival. Without sheep, people would have had to spend precious money buying wool from merchants, and that would have drained the economy. Life wasn't always easy for medieval villagers. Europe experienced a series of warm, wet years in the late 12th century, followed by a colder, drier period in the 13th century. These changing conditions led to widespread crop failures, food shortages, and famine. To make matters worse, a series of plagues swept through Europe, killing millions of people. The Black Death, which struck in the mid-14th century, killed at least a third of the population. All of these hardships contributed to the decline of the feudal system and the rise of new economic and political orders. The steady growth of towns and cities offered new opportunities for people seeking better lives. As more and more Europeans moved to urban centers, the medieval village began to disappear. While researching this topic, I came across a lot of information about medieval village life, but very little of it was based on primary sources. It seems like most articles and videos take a broad overview of the topic and then draw conclusions based on general knowledge of the time period. My goal was to do something different. So for this episode, I dug deep into primary sources, looking at accounts from medieval villagers to see what we can learn about their daily lives. What I found is that life in the Middle Ages wasn't as bad as many people think. Sure, there were hardships and challenges, but there was also joy, laughter, friendship, and community. Medieval villagers may not have had indoor plumbing or cell phones, but they had something far more valuable. They had each other. Medieval villages were dirty, stinky places to live, but they were home. So let's take a stroll through a typical medieval village and see what it was like. Most villagers got their water from wells. They carried their water in buckets, just like today. But unlike today, they didn't have any pipes or plumbing to bring the water into their homes. So every house had to be built with a well on the property. And the deeper the well, the more valuable the land. That meant that rich people could afford deeper wells, which gave them access to more water. Now, the water in these wells wasn't exactly clean, but it was treated better than the water we found in most rivers and streams. You see, most rivers and streams were full of animal droppings, so they weren't exactly safe to drink from. The water was also used for cleaning, so it wouldn't do to have your livestock swimming around in your drinking water. So people would boil the water to kill the bacteria, then let it cool and use it for drinking and cleaning. But sometimes people had to get their water from far away, like really far away. Like one English village had to get their water from a spring that was 2 miles away. Now, that's a long walk for someone who's already carrying a bucket of water. It took about an hour to get there, and then another hour to get back. That meant that some people would stay overnight at the spring to be closer to this precious liquid. But even still, they had to make the journey at least once a week. In some villages, women would cover up their buckets with sackcloth so that men couldn't see what was inside. This was especially important if they were carrying urine. Urine was used for cleaning, too, and it was easier to carry than water. So women would often carry both urine and water at the same time. Yeah, I think I'd rather carry the bucket. Some villages didn't have enough wells or springs, so they'd have to rely on rainwater. This meant that people would have to build homes with thick walls so that they could store up water during the rainy season. Without proper plumbing, though, the water would eventually evaporate or leak out of their homes. So rainwater harvesting wasn't always a reliable source of water. Luckily, most villages had a central source of water that everyone could use. It was called the village pond. These ponds were usually built near the center of town and were used for everything from cleaning clothes to watering crops. Villagers would dump their waste into the pond, along with dead animals and fish. That made it pretty gross, but it was also a good fertilizer for their crops. Crops grew well in medieval ponds because of all the extra nutrients. In fact, sometimes the ponds were the only place where crops could grow. The soil in medieval villages was so depleted of nutrients that the crops there were barely edible. Peasants had to grow most of their food far away from their villages on the lord's land. Then the lords would take most of the food and leave the peasants with whatever scraps they could find. But if there was a drought, those scraps became even scarcer. That meant that people had to get creative when it came to finding food. There were people called gleaners whose job it was to gather up the leftover grain after the workers were done harvesting. but gleaners weren't allowed to pick up the grain by hand. Instead, they had to use a tool called a cradle. A cradle is basically a large basket with a hoop at the top. The gleaner would pull the grain towards the cradle using a string attached to the hoop. The grain would fall into the basket and they could collect it and take it home. Gleaners were usually poor people who couldn't afford to buy food. Sometimes they'd find something else besides grain, like a lost shoe or a baby. I'm not kidding. One time, a peasant woman found a baby who had been abandoned in a field. She took him in and raised him as her own. The streets of medieval villages were narrow and winding, and the buildings were so close together that people could easily climb from one roof to the next. There were no cars or other noisy distractions, so people could easily chat with their neighbors over the walls. The walls were also helpful when enemies came to the village. People could hide on the roofs until the danger had passed. Life in a medieval village was full of sights, sounds, and smells you probably wouldn't want to experience firsthand. But if you were already living back then, you would have just gotten used to it. Things like open sewers, stray animals, chamber pots, people just dying in the street. All part of the daily routine. But one thing that stood out the most was the marketplace. And while we know the food stalls would be filled with the most delectable dishes from around the region, along with stalls selling all kinds of household items and tools, what about when it was time to buy something but you didn't have any money? After all, despite the amount of trade happening during the Middle Ages, the average person wasn't rolling in dough. So how did people go about buying things they wanted or needed when they couldn't pay for them? Welcome to my channel. Today, we're exploring the medieval marketplace. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit that thumbs up and subscribe for more. The marketplace was where the main action happened in the medieval village. It was the center of town where all the roads led to, where people gathered to trade goods and services and also catch up on the latest news and gossip. And it would have been an everyday occurrence for someone to visit the market to find a particular item they were looking for, or trade something they had made themselves for something else they needed. But money wasn't always the way to go about doing this. In fact, until relatively late into the Middle Ages, cash transactions weren't common at all. Instead, trade might be done by exchanging one good for another, such as bringing a dozen eggs to trade for a length of cloth. This is called a barter system, and is based on the idea of trading one thing for something else directly. So you wouldn't bring your eggs to the marketplace with the intention of getting money for them. Rather, you would trade them directly for the cloth you need from the clothier, who would then take your eggs and use them to make something else. Or perhaps the clothier had a child who needed new shoes, so he trades the cloth to the shoemaker for a pair of shoes. Then the shoemaker has some extra bread dough and trades it to the baker for bread for his family. The baker has extra eggs from the farm that morning and now trades those to you for your eggs. So you see how these items are just being traded back and forth. Now obviously this system requires that everyone in this little exchange has something the other person wants. Otherwise, the trade can't happen. It also means that if you don't have anything that the person you want to trade with wants, well, you aren't going to get very far. Additionally, how could you trade for something like a nail or a hammer unless you happen to have a cow to trade? It becomes rather cumbersome rather quickly, and a more universal medium of exchange becomes necessary. That's why eventually, coinage became the preferred method of payment. But even still, especially in smaller villages, bartering continued to be the main way to conduct business. At the market, you might see an old woman sit with a basket of apples and some onions, but no money. She might have made some cider, but she needs fresh eggs from the farmer. So she gives someone apples and onions in exchange for the eggs. How much an apple or onion is worth depends on the time of year and how plentiful they are. Likewise, the number of eggs she will give away depends on their value at the time. So how does the farmer now get money for the apples and onions, or the cobbler get money for the shoes he made from the cloth? He doesn't. Maybe he trades the shoes to the knight he saw earlier in the market who needs new riding boots. Or maybe he trades the shoes to the local lord, who in turn pays him with a bag of silver coins. See, unlike our farmer, the lord actually does have money, and he might have acquired that money by collecting taxes from the peasants on their farms, or by charging people to hunt in his woods, or fish in his ponds. Sometimes kings would even hold tournaments and charge people to participate, giving away prizes at the end to the winners. And if the cobbler wins the tournament and gets some money, how does he spend it? Well, maybe he goes to the tavern and buys everyone a round of drinks, or better yet, buys some new leather to make more shoes, or some wood to make a new leg vise. Money in the Middle Ages was rarely held on to for too long. Once someone had it, they wanted to spend it and get something useful in return. Medieval society was highly dependent on trade, not only for goods and services, but for food as well. Most people lived in agricultural communities where they grew their own crops and raised livestock, but they didn't necessarily have everything they needed. Spices, dyes, tools, weapons, clothing, building materials, the list goes on. All of these things had to come from somewhere, so trade routes developed between villages and towns and cities across the land. Caravans of pack animals would travel from village to village, bringing new and exciting goods with them that people had never seen before. These traveling merchants played an important role in the economy of the Middle Ages, not only because they brought rare and valuable goods, but because they also helped spread news and information about the world beyond their village. When they stopped to trade at the market, they would often stay for a while, setting up camp and making their wares known to the locals. While they were there, they would swap stories and rumors with the townspeople, filling them in on the happenings in other parts of the kingdom and spreading news of any battles or royal decrees. In some cases, these traveling merchants operated independently, working alone or in small groups, while in other cases, they were employed by wealthy merchants or nobles who commissioned them to buy specific goods or deliver messages. And while it might seem like they would have been rich and wealthy, given that they were traveling around with all kinds of valuable goods, life on the road was tough and dangerous, and most merchants didn't make enough to live comfortably. For many people, especially those living in rural areas, the marketplace was their only opportunity to interact with people outside of their immediate community. They looked forward to the day the merchants would arrive and set up shop in the village square. It was a chance to buy something they couldn't make or find in their own homes. But it was also a chance to hear about the wider world and maybe even pick up some gossip about people they knew who lived elsewhere. It's easy to imagine the medieval marketplace as a bustling, noisy place, filled with the chatter of merchants trying to sell their wares, the haggling of customers, and the bleating of sheep or pigs being sold for meat. It would have been a feast for the senses, filled with the sights, sounds, and smells of life in the Middle Ages. The school bell rings, summoning children from their homes. They walk past a blacksmith, hammering out a horseshoe. The local lord is riding by on his way to joust in the neighboring village. Peasants bowed to him, hoping he won't notice their small transgressions, like stealing firewood or poaching a rabbit. He's too busy trying to get his horse to stop eating his cloak. In the market, people are bartering for everyday items. A merchant hawking his wares is having trouble competing with the sound of a nearby church bell. It's Sunday, so everyone's off to mass. Bells were rung before and during the service to let the faithful know when to kneel or stand up. And afterwards, the celebration continues with a village feast. Everyone, including the Lord, is invited to share in the food and drink and dance the night away. These festivals honoring saints were the most joyous occasions in the medieval village, full of music and merriment. Villagers would often travel from neighboring towns to join the festivities. A traveling merchant from the Middle East might regale them with tales of exotic lands, or a juggler and acrobat might perform for their amusement. There was even a special dance, a kind of folk ballet performed by young men and women, a celebration of life and a tribute to the Virgin Mary. But not all was revelry and feasting in the medieval village. Every day was filled with hard work, and everyone had their chores to do. Men, women, and children rose before sunrise and went about their tasks. The fields needed tending, the animals needed feeding, and the Lord's taxes needed collecting. Life was hard, but it was also beautiful. The medieval village was a place where people worked hard and played hard. It was a place where life was short, but the people were always ready to celebrate it. A young girl skips rope with her friends while a group of boys play a game with a ball made of rags. They chase each other around the village green, their laughter echoing through the trees. A mother rocks her baby while she gossips with a neighbor. The child looks up at the colorful kites dancing in the sky and lets out a happy squeal. An old man sits on a bench, whittling a piece of wood. He watches the children playing and smiles. Life may be hard, he thinks, but as long as there are children, there is hope. And as the sun sets over the medieval village, the people gather together in the square to watch a traveling troupe perform a play. The story's funny and heartwarming, and the actors are so good that the villagers are on the edge of their seats. When the play is over, they give the actors a standing ovation. The children beg their parents for candy, and the adults reminisce about the good old days. As the fire burns low, the villagers start to head home. They say their prayers and tuck their children into bed. Then they, too, climb into bed and dream of another day in the life of the medieval village. The medieval village is usually thought of as a quiet, uneventful place, but that's not always true. Come with me now back to the olden times for an average day in the life of a medieval villager. So let's just suppose it's a normal day, if such a thing existed, in the life of a medieval village. You wake up before sunrise to the sound of church bells. The curfew has just been lifted, and the rooster crows, and the sheep bleat. For villagers, sleep schedules were determined by the amount of daylight available and the amount of work that needed doing. So whilst you might think that they'd go to bed early because there were a few oil lamps and candles, that wasn't necessarily the case. It was more a case of going to bed when you were tired and getting up when you had to. After walking, you get yourself ready for the day ahead. Men, women, and children all wear simple tunics with a belt, hose, or leggings, a hat, and sometimes a sword or a dagger. No one really wears underwear, but some will wear a codpiece. What you eat for breakfast depends on who you are. The poorest will have very little and eat their supper remnants. The wealthier villagers might enjoy bread, cheese, eggs, milk, ale, and meat. After eating, you say your prayers, and then it's out to work for most of the villagers. In a medieval village, 3/4 of the population were peasants. They worked from dawn till dusk, 6 days a week. Usually on their lord's land, they were growing crops like wheat, barley, oats, peas, and beans. Women and children weeded, threshed, and winnowed the crops, but it was heavy labor for them. For men, hunting wild animals to supplement their diet was important, as was protecting the village against wolves and other predators. The best hunters would be called upon to help the local lord when he went on hunts for his sport. A small percentage of the population were artisans. They could be blacksmiths, weavers, carpenters, masons, or fulas, which is what they used to call someone who cleans and finishes cloth. They might have their own business and work for themselves, or they might work for the lord of the manor or a wealthy merchant. There were also merchants in the village who would buy and sell things either locally or from afar, traveling to distant lands. Of course, there were also those who worked in the fields with the peasants, but they were employed by the lord. These were the layout params who managed the estate when the lord wasn't there. They took decisions about how much of each crop to plant and when to harvest, as well as collecting rents and looking after the lord's interests. Life for a medieval peasant was hard. For 10 months of the year, they followed their lord's instructions, working the land and paying him rent in the form of crops or money. Then for 2 months of the year, they could work their own small plot of land and keep what they grew. Medieval peasants weren't allowed to leave their village without permission, so they couldn't travel to find better paid work elsewhere. Their loyalty was expected to be given only to their lord. If you were a medieval peasant, you'd probably be praying a lot. You'd pray before you ate, before you went to bed, before you started work, and when you did your chores. Peasants were mostly illiterate, so they didn't read the Bible. Instead, they had priests to tell them what they should do. Religion permeated every aspect of life in the Middle Ages, and the church was at the center of the village, both physically and spiritually. In fact, the biggest building in the village would have been the church, standing proudly over the villagers and reminding them of God. The village was surrounded by a graveyard where people were buried, sometimes with their dead animals. The church was also the place where everyone came together. It was a community hub, a place to meet your friends and neighbors. It was here that you heard about events happening outside of your village, good and bad. Sometimes people would come to the church to hear a traveling bard play music and tell tales. Life in a medieval village revolved around the church. Most weeks there would be a saint's day to celebrate. Saints were often associated with particular places, so the saint whose name day it was would depend on where you lived. Church attendance was compulsory for Christians, and the service was in Latin, even if the villagers didn't understand Latin. If you couldn't get to church because you were working the fields, then you could pray at home. Services in the church were lengthy, and there was a lot of singing. Once the service was finished, there would often be a feast and dancing, and the local priests might even allow people to play games. This would have been a great time for young people to find a partner. At these events, you wouldn't want to be a spoiled sport, so you joined in with the celebrations. It would have been a rare medieval village that didn't have a well, and you'd certainly have had one if it was a larger settlement. Wells were usually near the center of the village and next to the church. The water was drawn up using a bucket and rope, and this water was used for drinking, washing, and cleaning. People preferred not to bathe, but if they did, this would have been where they'd fetch water from. However, The water wasn't clean, and it was common for people to use the same cup, bowl, or spoon. That meant that illnesses spread as typhoid and cholera were common, and small children often died. You may have noticed that we haven't mentioned toilets yet. Well, there weren't any public conveniences in the Middle Ages, so people just used the river, a bush, or the corner of a building. The urine was also collected and used for cleaning and for washing clothes. Urine was actually so important that it was measured, and there were even public bathrooms with pots for collecting it. Chamber pots were also used in the village, and they were emptied out at night. Someone would walk around with a ladder and empty all the contents into the river. As the morning wore on, you'll hear the sound of hammers, chisels, and anvils as the blacksmith works in his shop. His job is vital to the village because he makes and repairs tools and weapons. Another sound you might hear is that of a spinning wheel as the wives and daughters of the village make cloth from the flax they've been harvesting and preparing. Cloth making is an important part of life for women in the village, and they'll often spin and weave while sitting around chatting to each other. The midday bell rings from the church tower, and it's time for a break. For the peasants, they might eat the stew they've brought with them from home, or they might buy something from one of the market stalls that's set up near the entrance to the fields. While the peasants are working the land, merchants from afar pass through the village, walking along the road and calling out what they're selling. They might have spices, wine, cloth, or other items that they've brought from faraway lands. Villagers come out of their homes to listen to the merchants' wares, and they might purchase something. Sometimes traveling minstrels would perform for the entertainment of the villagers, and they might even join in with the fun. If there was a market in town, then many villagers would be there. Markets were held several times a year, and they were busy places full of stalls and activity. Peasants would bring produce from their farms to sell, and they could also buy things they couldn't make or grow themselves. Markets were lively affairs, with lots of noise and commotion. Peasants jostled for position and tried to get the best price for their goods. There were also traveling entertainers who performed for the crowds. By late afternoon, the sun is beginning its descent, and the villagers are heading back to their homes. A long day of work is done, and now it's time for rest. As the family gathers for supper, the evening is filled with conversation about the day's events and plans for tomorrow. Perhaps there'll be a story about a death in the village or news of an upcoming wedding. Maybe there's talk of a festival in a neighboring town or village. All these stories spread quickly in a close-knit community, and people were keen to share news and gossip. There was no electricity in the village, so after eating supper, the family gathered around a small fire and told stories. It was too dark to see anything beyond the room, and shadows danced on the walls as flames flickered. Once the stories were finished, it was time for bed. There were few blankets and no mattresses, so people slept on straw or hay. The smell of stale waste permeated everything, and rats and lice were common. Sleep came fitfully to the villagers, and they dreamed of festivals and feasts, market days, and maybe even of a life beyond the confines of their village. The medieval peasant worked from January to December, but they didn't celebrate Christmas in December or Easter in April. So when did they celebrate these holidays? Well, that depended on the bishop. See, the church was in charge of deciding when holy days would be celebrated, and different areas followed different bishops. This meant that holy days could be celebrated at different times throughout the year, and there were many holy days. For instance, All Saints' Day was celebrated on November, but it was moved to the first Sunday after the autumn equinox, so that it could be celebrated with more fervor. Christmas was celebrated on December, but that date was changed to the Sunday before the winter solstice, so that it could be celebrated with more light. Even Easter was moved from April to be celebrated on the Sunday after the spring equinox. That way there would be more daylight hours for people to attend church services. The date of Good Friday also depended on when Easter was celebrated, and since Easter was celebrated on a Sunday, Good Friday was celebrated on the Friday before, and the celebration of Easter Monday depended on Easter Sunday. So you can see how all of these holy days were in a constant state of flux, depending on the time of the year and which bishop you followed. But these weren't the only days off that the medieval peasant had. There were also market days. These were days when merchants would come to the village to sell their wares, and there were usually 4 of these per year, 1 for each season. These days were important because they provided the villagers with the opportunity to buy things that they couldn't get in their village. Sukas, spices, wine, and cloth. They also provided the villagers with the opportunity to sell their products to merchants who would then take them to the nearest city to sell them for a profit. There were also fairs, which were larger than markets and usually took place in the summer. Villagers would come from all around the area to trade goods and services, and there would often be games and entertainment for all ages. The most important fair of the year was the annual fair, which took place on the same day as the village's patron saint's day. This was a major event in the village calendar and was usually celebrated with a procession, a mass, and a feast. So as you can see, the medieval peasant had plenty of days off throughout the year. They might not have had the same holidays as we do today, but they still had plenty of opportunities to rest and relax. In the Middle Ages, life was heavily dictated by the seasons. The year was divided into two halves: the wet work of the farm, which took place from roughly March to October, and the dry work of the farm, which included everything else. This meant that work days started in March and ended in October. November through February were considered off-season. However, there were many holy days during this time, so farmers could still be busy. A typical workday began at sunrise and lasted until sunset, with 1 hour for dinner. Work in the fields was done by everyone from the lord to the peasant. Women typically worked in the home, but they also helped out in the fields when needed. Children too had regular chores, and they often looked after younger siblings while their parents worked. Dinner was an important part of the workday. It was a time for the family to come together and eat the simple meal that would sustain them through the long hours of work. Now let's talk about the holidays. The church had a huge impact on daily life in the Middle Ages, and it declared certain days as holy days, meaning that work could stop for a celebration or religious observance. There were many holy days throughout the year, including Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, Assumption Day, and All Saints' Day. During these times, people would attend church services and festivities would take place in the village. Sometimes there were even public executions on these days. Now let's look at some of the major holidays. Christmas was celebrated on December with a 12-day festival ending on January. The holiday season began on Christmas with a feast, religious services, and gift-giving. The New Year was celebrated on January with feasting and merriment. The celebration lasted for several days and included games, music, and dancing. Easter was a major holiday that celebrated the resurrection of Jesus Christ. It was a time for renewal and rebirth, and people would often decorate their homes with flowers and greenery. They would also attend church services, and some would participate in the Easter procession. Pentecost was a celebration of the Holy Spirit, and it was a major agricultural holiday. People would often decorate their homes with flowers and greenery, and they would attend church services. During the Middle Ages, people kept track of time in different ways. Some used a simple sundial, while others used a water clock or an hourglass. The most common type of clock was the mechanical clock, which was powered by weights or springs. These clocks were often large and expensive, so only the wealthy could afford them. Most peasants didn't have a clock, so they relied on the sun or other natural objects to tell the time. Now, let's look at some examples of medieval clocks. One example is the Salisbury Cathedral clock, which was built in the 1380s. It was one of the largest and most sophisticated clocks of its time. Another example is the clock at the Old Town Hall in Prague, which was built in the 14th century. This clock is famous for its astronomical features, including a lunar calendar and a table of the months. Life under the Lord's Manor was a complex system that defined the daily existence of medieval villagers. Picture this. You're a peasant, living in a small thatched roof cottage, surrounded by fields and forests. Your life revolves around the whims and demands of the local lord, who owns the land you work on and the very air you breathe. Now, let's talk about taxes. Oh boy, were there taxes. The lord expected a hefty chunk of everything you produced. Harvested some wheat. Better set aside a portion for the lord. Raised some chickens. You guessed it. Some of those eggs are heading straight to the manor. And it wasn't just food. Even the firewood you gathered had to be shared. But wait, there's more. Rent was another burden on the shoulders of medieval villagers. You see, the land you lived on wasn't yours. It belonged to the lord. So, you had to pay rent, often in the form of labor. This meant spending several days a week working the lord's fields, repairing his roads, or even helping to build his fancy new castle. The feudal hierarchy was like a giant pyramid, with the king at the top and the peasants at the bottom. In between, you had nobles, knights, and clergy, each level owing allegiance to the one above. As a viajer, you were at the very bottom, expected to obey not just the Lord, but anyone of higher rank. This system meant that your life was pretty much mapped out from birth. Born a peasant? You'd likely die a peasant. Social mobility was about as common as a dragon sighting. The Lord's word was law, and challenging it could lead to some pretty nasty consequences. But it wasn't all doom and gloom. The Mano system did provide some level of protection. In times of war or unrest, villagers could seek shelter within the Manasuals. The Lord was also expected to provide justice and settle disputes among his tenants. Of course, whether that justice was fair, well, that's another story. So there you have a glimpse into life under the Lord's manor. It was a world of heavy obligations, limited freedoms, but also a certain predictability. The feudal system may seem harsh to our modern eyes, but for medieval villagers, it was simply the way things were. Medieval villages were filthy, dangerous places. Life was hard, but it was also kind of fun. Let me explain. Medieval villages were mostly made up of little shops and houses, all crammed together with their animals. And because there was no such thing as indoor plumbing, all of their waste would just be dumped into the street. The streets themselves were normally dirty, muddy paths that would turn into giant piles of muck after it rained. The only positive thing about this, however, was that it made the villagers very inventive when it came to their garbage disposal systems. They would often build elaborate networks of pipes and tunnels underneath their homes, so they could easily get rid of their waste without having to walk outside and risk stepping in it. The medieval village would have a central area where people could buy and sell goods, kind of like a marketplace. But unlike a modern marketplace, this one would also have people getting publicly flogged and having their heads shaved as punishment for breaking the law. This was called the pit, and if you were unlucky enough to be put in it, you would stay there all day while people threw fruit and vegetables at you. If you were very naughty, you might even get locked up in the village stocks. And if you were really, really naughty, you might even get fined. And the worst part was that all of this was completely legal. In medieval times, every village would have a justice, sort of like a judge, who would oversee all of these punishments. And the person with the ultimate authority in the village would be the reeve, who was basically like the mayor, the chief of police, and the head of the secret police, all rolled into one. It was a very stressful job, but somebody had to do it. Life in a medieval village was tough, but it was also kind of fun. There's always something going on, and if you weren't too busy trying to survive, you might actually enjoy it. In this series, I'll be bringing you the sights, sounds, smells, and yes, even some of the worst parts of daily life in a medieval village. You can think of it as a time capsule from the Middle Ages that allows us to step back in time and experience what life was really like for the commoner. Medieval villages were no stranger to crime. In fact, they had quite a few crimes that we wouldn't even dream of today. But how did the villagers deal with these crimes? Well, they didn't have any fancy law enforcement system, so they relied on something called village justice. Now, you might be thinking, oh, so they just hung people or burned them at the stake for stealing chickens. Right? Wrong. Depending on the severity of the crime, the punishment could vary. For minor offenses like stealing, the punishment was usually a fine. The money would then go to the person who had been wronged, or more likely, their family. If the person was too poor to pay the fine, they could be put in stocks as punishment. Stocks were basically a wooden device that would hold someone in place, usually by the hands and feet, and sometimes with a board across the bottom to make it more uncomfortable. People would then be put into the stocks as punishment, and sometimes they'd be left there for days. This was usually done for smaller crimes, like getting drunk and disorderly or, making out with someone when you shouldn't have been. For bigger crimes, like, say, beating someone up, the punishment was more severe. The most common punishment for a crime like that was exile. That meant that the person had to leave the village and not come back. Sometimes, though, the punishment would be something a little bit more creative, and I mean that in the worst way possible. For example, one medieval court ordered a woman to be sewn up in a sack along with a cat, a dog, and a rooster, and then the next time a boat went down the river, they dumped the sack in. So yeah, things were rough if you weren't on the good side of the village justice system. But there was one other big problem. You see, while the villagers did their best to keep order in the community, they weren't always successful. And sometimes things got out of hand. Like, say, Someone decided to take revenge into their own hands. Or maybe a group of people just didn't like the punishment that had been handed out. Well, in a case like that, the village reeve, or head official, had the authority to step in and overrule the decision. This wasn't always a popular move, though, since the reeve wasn't elected and therefore wasn't accountable to the people. It's the year 1348, and you are a peasant living in a village in medieval Europe. The Black Death has just arrived in town, and you'd better get to work on your herb garden before the sun rises. You've got a lot of work to do. After all, you need to stay healthy so that you can pay your rent to Lord Oswald. And if he finds out that you have any of these 12 deadly diseases, you will be run out of town without your head. You'll spend all morning carefully tending to your plants, pulling out weeds, and making sure that there is enough of everything to keep you and your family alive. Rosemary and lavender are great for keeping away evil spirits, so you make sure to keep those by your door. At night, you will hang a charm made of garlic and bear's claws over your bed to keep the evil spirits away while you sleep. And you always say a prayer to Saint Benedict before eating to keep the demons and the food away. But even with all of these things, sometimes the evil spirits get through, so you keep a supply of holy water on hand, just in case. The local priest is a leech, so he sucks the blood out of the sick instead of cutting them and letting them bleed. If he's not around, then one of the village women will do it for him. After all, women were considered to be better at midwifery than men. They also knew how to treat sick children, which was good, because most of the time when a doctor was called in, he could do nothing but shake his head and tell them there was no hope. The only thing he could do was cut the baby's umbilical cord, and that was only to make sure that the mother didn't bleed to death. Most of the time, the baby would die anyway, but not always. So you always have a midwife on call, just in case. Speaking of babies, yours is due any day now, and you'd better get to work on the list of names you've chosen. You'll start with the obvious ones, John and Mary, but then you'll get more creative. Maybe Thomas or William. Well, actually, you don't really know what you're naming him. You haven't even met him yet. But one thing's for sure, whatever you name him, he will carry on the family name. Speaking of names, you'd better get to work on the letter you're going to send to the king. You see, he has a son who's about your son's age, and you'd like to get them married. You think that the king's son might become a powerful man one day, and if it does, then your son will be right there at his side. Plus, it'll look great on a resume. You just have to get past the king's counselors. They hate peasants, and wouldn't let the marriage happen, even if you weren't 70 years old. But you have a trick up your sleeve. You saw the last king die, and you know a secret that could bring the current king to his grave. All you have to do is threaten to reveal it, and the counselors won't have a choice but to agree to the marriage. And that's what you do. Every day in a medieval village. Oh, wait? No, that's not right. This is what you do every day in a medieval village. As soon as the sun rises, you have to get to work in the fields. You're a serf, and if you don't work the land, you won't have food to eat. And if Lord Oswald finds out that you aren't working hard enough, he will kick you off your land and you will starve to death. So you get to work, planting wheat, barley, oats, and peas. You'll work from sunrise to sunset, and if you aren't careful, you could easily be injured. You've seen people lose fingers and even eyes to the sharp tools, and you don't want that to happen to you. But you can't let your mind wander. If you think about anything other than the task at hand, you could make a mistake that results in serious injury. So you try to keep your mind off the fact that your son is about to be born and your husband is off hunting rabbits to make sure that you have something to eat tonight. When the work is done, you go home and tend to your small garden. You grow herbs and vegetables here that you will use to feed your family. You also keep a few chickens and a goat, and they provide you with eggs and milk to keep you alive. You don't have much time to relax, but when you do, you like to take a hot bath and read a book. Your favorite story is about a knight who goes on a quest to rescue a princess from a dragon. That reminds you, you should probably start thinking about a name for your daughter. Maybe Elizabeth or Joan. No, those names are too common. You want something unique. How about Christine? Yeah, that's perfect. The morning sun glints off the dew-covered grass as a family awakens in their wattle and daub hut. The father, a carpenter by trade, is already up and about, making repairs to a shutter. The mother stirs their two children awake, and soon the family is up and getting ready for the day. Their first task is to feed their animals. After that, it's time for breakfast. As the family eats, they discuss the events of the day. The children will help their mother with repairs to the wattle and daub, while the father heads into the village to meet with his fellow carpenters. These carpenters are constructing a large timber frame building for the village. The men work quickly and efficiently, knowing that they must finish the frame before winter sets in. Each man has a specific job, and they work in unison to complete the task at hand. Soon, the skeleton of the new building is complete. The carpenters move on to other projects, leaving the half-finished building behind. Our family's day is almost over. They stop their work to watch the sunset over the fields. It's been a long day, but they're happy to have the new building finished before winter. They head home and tuck into bed, dreaming of the next day's adventures. A young boy peeks out from behind a wattle and daub hut. He watches as a group of men work on a new building project. One of the men looks up and sees the boy watching them. He waves to the child, who waves back shyly. As the boy's father finishes his work for the day, he joins his son and asks him what he's doing. The boy tells his father that he wants to be a builder when he grows up. His father smiles and nods, proud of his son's ambition. The family prepares dinner over an open fire. The aroma of roasting meat and vegetables fills the air. The family eats together, talking about their day. The mother asks her son how his school lessons are going. He tells her that he's learning a lot and that he enjoys writing the most. She beams at him, knowing that her son is bright and eager to learn. After dinner, the family gathers around a small table. The father pulls out a book and begins reading to his children. They listen intently, hanging on every word. When the father finishes the story, the children ask for another. He obliges, and soon the children are fast asleep. The parents tuck them into bed and kiss them goodnight. It's been a long day, but the family is happy. They're grateful for their cozy hut, their food, and each other. As the moon shines through the window, they drift off to sleep. In the heart of a medieval village, nestled between a bakery and a blacksmith's shop, stands a simple yet sturdy wattle and daub hut. Its thatched roof is a testament to generations past, while its mud walls whisper tales of those who have come and gone. Inside, a family of 5 is busy preparing for the day ahead. The eldest son, Thomas, is helping his father, John, mend a basket. The younger son, William, is feeding their chickens, while the mother, Elizabeth, prepares breakfast. The youngest daughter, Mary, is helping her mother by gathering eggs, and the eldest daughter, Anne, is tending to the family's small herb garden. The family's day is filled with a variety of tasks, both big and small. They work together as a team, each member contributing to the well-being of the other. As the sun climbs higher in the sky, the family takes a break to enjoy a simple meal together. They share stories and laughter, creating memories that will last a lifetime. After lunch, it's back to work. Thomas and John are heading into the village to collect supplies for a new construction project. William is helping Elizabeth prepare dinner, while Mary and I are tending to the animals. As the sun begins its slow descent, the family gathers once again. They help each other finish their chores and prepare for the evening ahead. Once everything is complete, they gather around their table for a simple meal. After dinner, it's time for bed. The children tuck themselves in and drift off to sleep, dreaming of the adventures that await them tomorrow. And so another day ends in the life of a medieval village family, filled with hard work, laughter, and the love of family. Meanwhile, on the outskirts of town, a lone traveler makes his way to a small hut. He knocks on the door, and a woman opens it. She invites him in and offers him food and shelter for the night. The traveler accepts her offer, and soon he, too, is fast asleep. In the morning, the traveler wakes up and thanks the woman for her hospitality. He offers to pay her for her kindness, but she refuses his payment. She tells him that she is a healer and that helping others is her calling. The traveler is moved by her words, and he continues on his way, feeling refreshed and ready to face the day. The sun climbs higher in the sky as people go about their daily activities. A merchant arrives in town with a cart full of goods. He sets up a stall in the marketplace and begins selling his wares. People from the village gather around his stall, eager to buy the latest fashions and other items. The merchant is pleased with the turnout, and he does a brisk business. As the day wears on, more and more people arrive in town. There are farmers selling fresh produce, butchers selling meat and bakers selling bread. The market is a hive of activity as people buy and sell all sorts of goods. Among the crowd is a young woman named Isabella. She's looking for a new dress to wear to the upcoming royal ball. She finds a beautiful gown in the merchant's stall and she buys it without hesitation. She also picks up some accessories to complete her ensemble. As the afternoon progresses, the energy in the marketplace begins to wane. People start to head home, taking their purchases with them. The merchant packs up his stall and heads back to his inn. He's tired from the day's work, but he's also content. He's made enough money to keep his business going and he's met some interesting people along the way. Isabella returns home, excited to show off her new dress to her friends. She knows that she'll be the belle of the ball, and she can't wait. As the sun sets over the horizon, the people of the village settle in for the night. They think back on the day's events and look forward to the adventures that await them tomorrow. And so another day comes to an end in the bustling medieval village. As the sun rises over the horizon, a rooster crows, signaling the start of a new day in the village. People begin to stir in their homes and the sound of hammering and sawing fills the air as the village carpenter begins work on a new project. Suddenly, a loud crash is heard and the carpenter rushes to the source of the noise. He finds a young boy who has fallen off a ladder while trying to retrieve a kite that became stuck in a tree. The carpenter helps the boy down and after ensuring he's unharmed, he continues his work. Throughout the day, people go about their daily activities. A group of women gather round a well, chatting as they draw water. A merchant arrives in town with a wagon full of goods, and a traveling musician entertains passers-by with his lively tunes. As lunchtime approaches, the smell of baking bread wafts through the village, enticing people to the local bakery. Inside, a baker pulls a fresh loaf from the oven and a customer selects a crusty piece of bread to take home. In the afternoon, a group of children play a rousing game of tag in the village square, while an old man sits on a nearby bench, watching them with a smile. A young girl approaches the old man and asks him to share a story, and he obliges, captivating her with tales of his youth. As the sun begins its descent, people rush to complete their daily tasks. A farmer guides his flock of sheep back to the fold. A family gathers around a table for dinner, and a young couple steals a kiss goodbye as the man prepares to join a group of soldiers on a mission. As darkness falls, the village is illuminated by the soft glow of oil lamplights spilling from windows and the flickering flames of hearth fires. People tuck their children into bed and the sound of crickets fills the air. A lone owl hoots in the distance, and the moon and stars twinkle in the inky sky above the peaceful village. And so another day ends in the enchanting medieval village. When you think of medieval villages, you probably imagined thatched cottages, dirt roads, and maybe a drawbridge or two. But what about the sounds of a medieval village? What would it have sounded like to live in a medieval village? Well, that's what we're going to find out today. As the sun rises over the village, the sound of church bells can be heard ringing out across the land. This is the local church, and the bells are being rung to announce the start of a new day. The ringing can also be heard at the beginning and end of services, and depending on the size of the church, the bells will be rung before morning, midday, and evening prayer. The biggest and most important bell is usually reserved for major royal events, such as the birth of a king or even a royal wedding. The next sound we hear is that of clucking hens. Most villagers will keep chickens, and their clucking can be heard throughout the day as they roam the streets looking for food. Chickens were not only a source of food, but also provided eggs, which was a welcome source of protein. Not only chickens, but also pigs and cattle can be heard oinking and mooing as they make their way to market. The animals are often driven along the streets by their owners, and the sound of their hooves on the cobblestones is a common occurrence. Another sound we hear is the blacksmith's hammer as he works his forge. The rhythmic clang of the hammer is a familiar sound in the village, and it is a sign of the blacksmith's skill and precision. The blacksmith is an important member of the community, and he is responsible for making and repairing all of the village's metalwork, from tools to weapons. His shop is always busy, and the sound of his hammer echoes through the village. What did people do for fun in the Middle Ages? Evenings in the village began with the storyteller. The old man sat in his usual spot by the fire, mesmerized by the dancing flames. Villagers would slowly make their way to the central courtyard, drawn in by the flickering light and the promise of a good yarn. There were no street lamps in the medieval village, so the storyteller's fire was the only source of light after sunset. The villagers would sit around the fire, their faces illuminated by the warm glow, listening intently to the old man's tales. Some stories were scary, some were funny, but all of them were filled with adventure and intrigue. As the night wore on, the fire began to die down, and the old man's voice grew softer. The villagers didn't mind, though they were used to listening to him spin his tales for hours on end. As the fire burned low, the villagers began to make their way home, their steps echoing in the stillness of the night. Inside their homes, the villagers would tuck themselves into bed, their minds still racing with the images and sounds from the evening's entertainment. There were no electric blankets or hot water bottles back in the Middle Ages, so the villagers had to rely on layers of clothing and each other for warmth. Men, women, and children slept in the same bed, and the only source of heat came from the fire in the hearth. Despite the cold and the darkness, the villagers were content. They had each other and their stories to keep them company, and that was all that mattered. As the first rays of sunlight peeked over the horizon, the villagers began to stir. They had a long day of work ahead of them, so they had to get up early and start fresh. What did people do for fun in the Middle Ages? Medieval villages were full of activity. Even at night, people didn't have much to do for fun, but that didn't stop them from enjoying the simple things in life. The evenings were spent telling stories, singing songs, and playing games by the firelight. It was a time for the community to come together and share in each other's company. The storyteller was always the center of attention. He would sit in a chair by the fire and weave tales of adventure and intrigue. The villagers would hang on every word, and there was always a hushed reverence when he spoke. Sometimes the stories were scary, but the storyteller knew just how to build suspense and keep his audience on the edge of their seats. Other times, the stories were funny, and the villagers would laugh along with the tale. But no matter what this story, there was always a sense of wonder and excitement in the air. As the night went on, the fire began to die down and the shadows grew longer. The villagers started to make their way home, their heads full of the stories they had just heard. Even the children were enthralled by the storyteller's tales, and they would often stay up late just to hear one more story before bed. It wasn't unusual for the villagers to spend all night talking and socializing. They didn't have much to do for fun, so they made the most of their time together. They would discuss the events of the day, gossip about their neighbors, and plan for the future. The men would talk about hunting and farming, while the women would discuss cooking and child-rearing, and the children would listen intently, soaking up the knowledge and experience of the adults. As the night wore on, the conversation would gradually turn to more serious topics. The villagers would debate politics and religion, and they wouldn't shy away from discussing the problems and challenges facing their community. But even when the conversation turned somber, there was always a sense of camaraderie among the villagers. They knew that they could rely on each other for support, and they took comfort in knowing that they weren't alone in their struggles. As the first light of dawn began to appear, the villagers started to make their way home. They were tired but content, and they couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction that came from a night well spent. What did people do for fun in the Middle Ages? People in the Middle Ages didn't have much access to modern forms of entertainment, but they still found ways to have fun. They enjoyed playing games such as chess and dice games, as well as participating in local festivals and celebrations. Attending church services was also a popular pastime, as was reading books and religious texts. People also liked to dance and make music, and there were many different types of dances and instruments popular during this time period. What did people wear in the Middle Ages? Clothing in the Middle Ages was typically made of wool, linen, or hemp. Men usually wore tunics and hose, while women wore dresses and aprons. People of higher status might have worn more luxurious fabrics such as silk or velvet, and they might have also worn jewelry and other accessories. What did people eat in the Middle Ages? The typical medieval diet consisted of a variety of dishes made with meat, fish, fruits, and vegetables. Some common ingredients included bread, cheese, eggs, and milk. Alcohol was also a popular part of the medieval diet, with beer being the most common type of alcoholic beverage consumed. How were houses built in the Middle Ages? Houses in the Middle Ages were typically made of wood or stone and had thatched roofs. They might have been 1 or 2 stories tall and would have featured things such as bay windows and chimneys. The interior of the house might have had wooden beams and floors, and the rooms would have been sparsely furnished. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe for more content.